Mark Thompson had always been a man of simple tastes and practical solutions. After a long, successful career as a structural engineer, he had retired to a quiet, tree-lined street just outside the boundaries of a sprawling, upscale HOA-controlled neighborhood. His property, a modest, single-story ranch house with a large, detached garage and a wide, meticulously landscaped front lawn, sat on the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction. The thick, carefully trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his driveway, serving as the unofficial border between his independent, self-sufficient world and the tightly regulated, carefully curated empire of white picket fences and perfectly manicured lawns that made up the neighboring community. For Mark, the location was perfect, close enough to the amenities and conveniences of the city, yet far enough removed from the noise and chaos of the tightly packed, cookie-cutter suburbs that surrounded it. The long, winding driveway and tall, swaying branches of the old oak trees that lined the edge of his property providing him with the peace, privacy, and quiet he had always craved. But not everyone saw it that way. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had taken one look at Mark's carefully landscaped front lawn and neatly painted house and decided, with a sharp, dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand, that it clashed with the carefully cultivated aesthetic of her tightly controlled, meticulously regulated community. To Karen, the sight of Mark's old, weathered house and thick, carefully trimmed hedges was an affront, a direct challenge to her unspoken authority over the neighborhood, a blatant disregard for the carefully crafted image of suburban perfection she had spent years cultivating. It wasn't long before Karen made her displeasure known. Mark had just finished installing a new set of solar-powered lights along the edge of his driveway, the thin, polished metal stakes glowing softly in the warm, late afternoon sunlight as he tightened the last bolt with a sharp, satisfying twist of his thick, calloused fingers, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled satisfaction as he stepped back to admire his handiwork. The long, neatly trimmed rows of thick, green hedges casting long, twisted shadows across the cool, polished surface of his driveway as the warm, late afternoon breeze rustled through the tall, swaying branches of the old oak trees that lined the edge of his property. But as he straightened, his broad, muscular shoulders casting a long, imposing shadow across the sunlit grass of his front lawn, he heard the sharp, insistent click of high heels on concrete, the sharp, staccato footsteps echoing off the cool, polished marble tiles of his front porch as Karen marched up the narrow, gravel path that led to his front door, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she reached for the thick, brass handle of his front door and rapped sharply on the cool, polished surface of the thick, wooden frame. Mark wiped his large, calloused hands on the thin, worn rag he had tucked into the back pocket of his jeans, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled suspicion as he reached for the thick, brass handle of his front door and pulled it open with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of his front hallway as he greeted Karen with a short, curt nod. "Can I help you, Karen?" he asked, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he leaned against the thick, polished wooden frame of his front door and met Karen's sharp, icy glare with one of his own. "Yes, actually," Karen snapped, her voice sharp, brittle, her tone dripping with the cold, calculated confidence of someone who had never been challenged. "I've had several complaints about your property. Your hedges are too tall, your paint color is too bold, and your landscaping is, well, it just doesn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. You'll need to make some changes if you want to avoid further issues." Mark felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he listened to her rant, his large, calloused hands clenching in a tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides as he fought to keep his voice calm, his deep, dark eyes never leaving hers as he replied. "My property is outside the HOA's jurisdiction," he said, his voice low, steady, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "I'm not subject to your rules, and I have no intention of changing my landscaping to suit your tastes." Karen's lips thinned, her thin, pale cheeks flushing a faint shade of pink as she straightened, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the cool, polished marble tiles of Mark's front porch as she took a small, hesitant step back, her thin, carefully made-up face twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she replied. "Very well," she spat, her voice rising an octave as her frustration began to seep through the cracks in her polished, suburban facade. "We'll see about that." With that, she turned on her heel, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the cool, polished marble tiles of Mark's front porch as she marched back down the narrow, gravel path that led to his front door, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she disappeared around the corner of his house, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured plastic of her phone as she dialed the number for the HOA office and began whispering her lies into the thin, polished speaker of her phone. The next morning, as Mark stepped into his garage, his large, calloused hands wrapped around the thick, polished metal handle of his garage door, his sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled suspicion as he took in the sight before him. Karen's massive, bright red Ford Raptor, its thick, polished metal frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the cool, polished concrete floor of his garage as it sat parked directly in the middle of the narrow, sunlit space, its thick, polished tires digging deep, jagged grooves into the smooth, polished surface of the concrete as it blocked access to his workbench and tools. Mark felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had taken her campaign of petty, vindictive harassment to a whole new level, one that threatened not just his property, but his entire way of life. Mark Thompson had always been a patient man, his long, successful career as a structural engineer having taught him the value of calm, measured decision-making and the importance of carefully weighing one's options before taking action. But as the days passed and Karen's campaign of petty harassment escalated, he found his patience wearing thin, his large, calloused hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides as he watched the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property stretch slowly across the cool, polished surface of his driveway, the faint, rhythmic hum of his lawn mower blending smoothly with the quiet, whispering rustle of the wind through the tall, swaying branches of the oak trees that lined the edge of his front yard. The first sign that Karen had escalated her campaign came in the form of a thick, crisp, white envelope that arrived in his mailbox one bright, breezy Tuesday morning, its sharp, clean edges glowing softly in the bright, mid-morning sunlight as Mark pulled it from the small, metal slot of his front door mailbox and scanned the neatly typed text of the return address, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled suspicion as he took in the sight of the HOA's official seal, its thick, polished, metal surface glinting softly in the warm, late morning sunlight as he carefully tore the envelope open with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist and unfolded the thick, heavy sheet of crisp, white paper contained within. The letter, which had been carefully drafted on the thick, polished letterhead of the HOA's official stationery, demanded that Mark contribute to the HOA's landscaping and maintenance fund. Its dense, neatly typed paragraphs carefully outlining the many benefits of supporting the community's shared resources and the importance of maintaining a consistent, cohesive aesthetic throughout the neighborhood. Its thin, polished metal seal glinting softly in the warm, late morning sunlight as Mark's large, calloused fingers tightened around the thick, polished edge of the crisp, white paper, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had no intention of backing down. But the letters were just the beginning. Over the next few days, Mark began to notice a subtle but unmistakable shift in the way his neighbors treated him. The small, friendly waves and nods he had grown accustomed to over the years were replaced by tight-lipped glares and averted eyes. The quiet, neighborly conversations he once enjoyed now reduced to strained, uncomfortable silences as his once friendly neighbors hurried past his house, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting nervously toward the narrow, gravel path that led to his front door. He found small, neatly folded pieces of paper tucked beneath the thick, brass handle of his front door, their thin, polished surfaces glowing softly in the bright, mid-morning sunlight as he unfolded them and scanned the neatly typed text within, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he read the thinly veiled threats and passive-aggressive critiques of his choice of paint colors, lawn decorations, and even the placement of his trash cans, the sharp, cutting words of his. Neighbors whispered accusations drifting through the thin, rustling leaves of his carefully cultivated hedges like the whispered hiss of a snake. Your paint color is too bold. Your lawn decorations are too tacky. Your trash cans are an eyesore. But the final straw came one bright, breezy Saturday morning. As Mark stepped out onto his front porch, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, his sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled suspicion as he watched a large, rusted tow truck rumble slowly down the narrow, gravel path that lined the edge of his front lawn, its thick, polished metal frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the cool, polished surface of his driveway as it pulled to a sharp, screeching halt in front of his garage, its thick, polished metal winch clinking softly against the rough, textured surface of the polished concrete as the driver climbed out and began hooking Mark's car to the thick, rusted metal frame of the tow truck's hydraulic lift. Mark felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he stormed down the narrow, gravel path that led to his driveway, his thick, steel-toed boots clomping softly against the cool, polished marble tiles of his front porch as he reached for the thick, polished brass handle of his front gate and pulled it open with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had escalated her campaign of petty, vindictive harassment to a whole new level, one that threatened not just his property, but his entire way of life. "What do you think you're doing?" Mark growled, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of his front yard like a blade, his tone low, steady, each word carefully enunciated as he fixed the tow truck driver with a cold, unblinking stare. The driver, a short, thin man with a thick, salt and pepper beard and a faint, nervous twitch in his left eye, hesitated for a brief, telling moment, his thin, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of the thick, rusted metal winch as he glanced nervously at Mark, his thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, uncomfortable scowl as he considered his response, his thin, polished lips twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as he replied. "Sorry, buddy," he said, his voice low, hesitant, his tone carefully measured as he leaned back against the thick, rusted metal frame of the tow truck's hydraulic lift, his thin, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of the thick, rusted metal as he continued. "Got a call from the HOA. Something about your car blocking access to a resident's vehicle and violating the neighborhood's parking rules." Mark felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had crossed a line, one that he would not allow her to cross again. Mark Thompson had always prided himself on his calm, measured approach to conflict, his long, successful career as a structural engineer having taught him the value of careful planning, meticulous preparation, and the importance of maintaining a cool head under pressure. But as the days passed and Karen's campaign of petty harassment escalated, he found his patience wearing thin, his large, calloused hands clenching in a tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides as he watched the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property stretch slowly across the cool, polished surface of his driveway, the faint, rhythmic hum of his lawn mower blending smoothly with the quiet, whispering rustle of the wind through the tall, swaying branches of the oak trees that lined the edge of his front yard. After the incident with the tow truck, Mark decided that enough was enough. He had tolerated Karen's aggressive letters, her passive-aggressive notes, and her thinly veiled threats for long enough. It was time to push back, to assert his rights, to make it clear that he would not be intimidated by the petty, vindictive woman who had declared war on his peace and quiet. So, one bright, breezy Monday morning, as Mark sat at his kitchen table, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. His sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled anger as he reviewed the grainy, black and white footage from his security cameras. His heart sank as he took in the sight of Karen's massive, bright red Ford Raptor parked in the middle of his garage, its thick, polished metal frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the cool, polished concrete floor as it blocked access to his workbench and tools, its thick, polished tires digging deep, jagged grooves into the smooth, polished surface of the concrete as it sat parked directly in the middle of the narrow, sunlit space. Frustrated but not beaten, Mark took a deep, steadying breath, his broad, muscular chest rising and falling with the effort as he forced himself to remain calm, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the thick, neatly typed pages of his security logs as he reached for his phone, his large, calloused fingers moving with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to control as he dialed the number for the local police department, his pulse thundering in his ears as he listened to the faint, distant hum of the ringing line, the cool, artificial tone echoing through the quiet, empty air of his kitchen as he waited for someone to pick up. After a few long, tense moments, the line clicked and a thin, high-pitched voice crackled through the small, black speaker of his phone, the faint, electronic hiss of the connection crackling softly in the background as the dispatcher answered the call. "City Police, what's your emergency?" the voice asked, the faint, tinny echo of the line crackling softly in the background as the dispatcher spoke, her tone calm, professional, her words carefully measured as she waited for Mark to reply. "Yes," Mark said, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of his kitchen like a blade, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "I'd like to file a report. My property has been trespassed on. I have video evidence of my neighbor, Karen, using my garage without my permission, parking her vehicle in my private space, and blocking access to my tools and workbench. I'd like an officer to come out and take a statement." There was a brief, telling pause on the other end of the line, the faint electronic hiss of the connection crackling softly in the background as the dispatcher hesitated, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, uncomfortable scowl as she considered her response, her thin, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured plastic of her phone as she chose her words with the careful, deliberate precision of a woman trying to defuse a bomb. "All right, sir," she said finally, her voice low, hesitant, her tone carefully measured as she leaned back in her chair, her thin, angular frame creaking softly against the polished, black leather as she continued. "I'll send an officer out to take a look. Please remain on your property and wait for the officer to arrive." Mark hung up the phone slowly, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly as he set the small, black device down on the polished, wooden surface of his desk, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he listened to the faint, distant hum of the approaching police car, its low, throaty engine rumbling softly as it pulled up to the curb outside his house, the thick, black tires crunching softly against the loose, compacted gravel of his driveway as the officer climbed out and made his way slowly, deliberately up the narrow, gravel path that led to Mark's front door. But as the officer approached, his thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, uncomfortable scowl as he reached for the thick, brass handle of Mark's front door, Mark felt his heart sink with a cold, sinking certainty as he caught sight of the thin, polished badge pinned to the man's chest, its thick, polished surface glinting softly in the warm, late afternoon sunlight as the officer reached for his notebook and cleared his throat, his thin, polished lips twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as he spoke. "Mr. Thompson," the officer said, his voice low, hesitant, his tone carefully measured as he flipped through the neatly typed pages of his notebook, his sharp, dark eyes flicking briefly toward the thick, reinforced frame of Mark's garage as he continued. "I've known Karen for years. She's a respected member of this community, a generous, upstanding neighbor, a dedicated volunteer. I find it hard to believe that she would do something like this. Are you sure you're not just overreacting? This sounds like petty neighbor drama. a personal dispute, not something the police should be involved in. Mark felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he listened to the officer's thin, polished voice crackle through the small, black speaker of his phone, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had more allies in the community than he had thought. Her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she whispered her lies, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she spread her venomous gossip through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. Karen had grown increasingly confident in the weeks since Mark's failed attempt to file a formal complaint with the local police. She had convinced herself that she had won, that her carefully crafted campaign of petty harassment and thinly veiled threats had finally broken the quiet, unassuming man who had dared to challenge her authority. Her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she whispered her venomous lies to her rapidly dwindling circle of allies, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she spread her poison through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. But just as Karen prepared to make her final move, to push for the decisive vote that would see Mark fined, humiliated, and driven from the neighborhood for good, she received a piece of mail that would shatter her carefully constructed empire of lies and manipulation. The letter arrived one bright, breezy Tuesday morning, the thick, crisp, white envelope slipping silently through the narrow, brass slot of her front door and landing with a faint, muffled thump on the polished, marble tiles of her foyer. Karen frowned, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, irritated scowl as she bent to pick it up, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured paper as she turned the envelope over in her hands, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing in suspicion as she caught sight of the high-profile law firm's logo stamped across the front in bold, black ink. She tore the envelope open with a sharp, irritated flick of her wrist, her thin, carefully made-up face twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she unfolded the thick, heavy sheet of crisp, white paper contained within, her sharp, blue eyes scanning the densely typed text with a growing sense of dread as she read and reread the letter, her heart sinking with a cold, sinking certainty as the full, horrifying implications of the message began to sink in. It turned out that Mark wasn't just a retired engineer. He was a former city planner and zoning expert, one of the architects behind the very regulations that define the boundaries of the HOA, his decades of experience in the field making him one of the most respected and influential figures in the industry. His carefully crafted, meticulously maintained network of contacts and connections giving him the power, influence, and resources to destroy her carefully cultivated empire of petty, suburban control with a single, well-timed phone call. And his property, the modest single-story ranch house with a large, detached garage and wide, meticulously landscaped front lawn that Karen had so casually dismissed as unapproved and out of place, was explicitly exempt from the HOA's control, its thick, polished metal gates and tall, neatly trimmed hedges standing as a silent, unspoken testament to his independence. His carefully drafted property deed and legal documents spelling out in cold, impersonal detail the long list of exemptions and protections that shielded his property from the petty, vindictive reach of Karen's carefully cultivated empire. Karen felt her heart skip a beat, her thin, pale lips parting in a silent, gasping breath as the thin, neatly typed lines of the letter seemed to blur before her eyes, her mind reeling with 1,000 silent, frantic thoughts as she realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that she had just declared war on a man with the power, influence, and resources to destroy her life, her reputation, and her carefully cultivated empire of petty, suburban authority. And Mark, it seemed, had finally decided to fight back. The following Thursday, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property crept slowly across the cool, polished marble tiles of the HOA meeting hall. Mark arrived dressed sharply, his tall, broad frame wrapped in a crisp, dark suit, the sharp, clean lines of the tailored fabric hugging his powerful, well-defined shoulders as he strode through the double doors and into the cool, brightly lit foyer of the building, his polished, black leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished, white marble tiles as he made his way slowly, deliberately toward the front of the room. The room fell silent as he entered, the faint, nervous whispers of the assembled crowd fading into a tense, strained stillness as the members of the HOA turned to stare at him, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously toward the thick, leather-bound stack of documents that Mark carried in his large, calloused hands, the thick, polished leather creaking softly against the smooth, polished surface of the podium as he set it down with a sharp, satisfying thump. Mark cleared his throat, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of the room like a blade as he began to speak, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as his sharp, dark eyes scanned the assembled crowd, his broad, muscular frame radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low, steady, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "I have come here tonight to address the numerous, baseless accusations that have been leveled against me by your HOA president, Karen Miller." A faint, nervous murmur rippled through the crowd, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously between Mark's tall, imposing frame and the sharp, angular features of their once loyal leader, her pale, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the polished, white marble tiles as she crossed and uncrossed her long, slender legs. Mark calmly presented his evidence, including security footage, property deeds, and legal notices detailing Karen's trespassing, property theft, and harassment. He hinted at a looming civil lawsuit for property damage, defamation, and emotional distress, his deep, dark voice ringing out through the still, silent air of the room, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he laid out his case, his large, calloused fingers flipping through the thick, leather-bound stack of documents with the practiced, automatic precision of a man accustomed to control, to power, to authority. The week following the explosive HOA meeting was a tense, uneasy one for the residents of the quiet, tree-lined streets that made up Mark's upscale suburban neighborhood. The whispered gossip and nervous, furtive glances that had once defined life in the tightly knit, carefully curated cul-de-sacs had been replaced by a strained, uncomfortable stillness, the small, friendly waves and nods of Mark's neighbors now reduced to tight-lipped glares and averted eyes as they hurried past his house, their faces pale and drawn, their nervous, whispered conversations echoing faintly through the cool, early morning air as they scurried down the narrow, gravel paths that lined the edge of his property. But Mark, for his part, had returned to his quiet, unassuming routine, his large, calloused hands moving with the calm, steady precision of a seasoned professional as he carefully trimmed the long, neatly edged rows of lush, green grass that lined the edge of his front lawn. His sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled satisfaction as he watched the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property stretch slowly across the cool, polished surface of his driveway, the faint, rhythmic hum of his lawn mower blending smoothly with the quiet, whispering rustle of the wind through the tall, neatly trimmed branches of the oak trees that lined the edge of his front yard. But even as he went about his daily chores, his mind remained sharp, focused, his thoughts never straying far from the petty, vindictive woman who had declared war on his peace and quiet, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she whispered her lies, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she spread her poison through the tightly knit web of their shared suburban world. He had not forgotten the many small, petty acts of theft and vandalism that had marked the long, bitter months of their conflict. The sharp, stinging pain of each shattered flower bed, each shredded hydrangea, each carefully trimmed row of bright, colorful sunflowers ripped from the cool, dark earth and scattered across the smooth, polished surface of his driveway, a constant, nagging reminder of her petty, vindictive nature and her utter disregard for the rights and boundaries of others. So, when Mark had finished laying out his case at the HOA meeting, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of the room as he presented his thick, leather-bound stack of documents, his large, calloused fingers flipping through the neatly typed pages with the practiced, automatic precision of a seasoned professional, he had made one final, quiet addition to his carefully planned, meticulously executed campaign of quiet, unassuming revenge. A week later, as Karen sat at her small, tidy kitchen table, the cool, early morning light filtering through the thin, sun-bleached curtains that framed her small, weathered window, she heard the sharp, insistent ring of her doorbell echo through the quiet, empty air of her home, the shrill, metallic chime cutting through her thoughts like the sudden, jarring crack of a gunshot. Frowning, Karen rose slowly from her chair, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, irritated scowl as she reached for the thick, brass handle of her front door, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the smooth, polished metal as she pulled the door open with a sharp, irritated flick of her wrist, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing in thinly veiled suspicion as she found herself face to face with a tall, thin man in a crisp, dark suit, his thin, angular face twisted into a tight, professional smile as he held out a thick, crisp, white envelope, its sharp, clean edges glowing softly in the bright, mid-morning sunlight. "Karen Miller," the man asked, his voice smooth, polished, his tone dripping with the cold, calculated confidence of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. "Yes," Karen replied, her voice sharp, brittle, her tone laced with a faint, involuntary quaver as she took a small, hesitant step back, her thin, carefully made-up face twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she reached for the thick, white envelope, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured paper as she pulled it from the man's outstretched hand, her sharp, blue eyes flicking nervously between his thin, unreadable face and the neat, blocky letters of the high-profile law firm's logo stamped across the front of the envelope. Without another word, the man turned on his heel, his thin, polished shoes clicking sharply against the rough, uneven pavement of Karen's front porch as he strode quickly, purposefully down the narrow, gravel path that led to her driveway, his thin, angular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the cool, sunlit grass of her front lawn as he climbed into a sleek, black sedan and sped off down the street. The low, throaty rumble of the engine echoing off the neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of her property as he disappeared around the corner. The envelope contained a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from Mark, seeking damages for harassment, property damage, and emotional distress. The HOA, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, voted unanimously to remove Karen as president, stripping her of her power and leaving her once pristine reputation in ruins. Her neighbors, finally seeing her for the bully she is, shun her completely, their small, friendly waves and nods replaced by tight-lipped glares and averted eyes as they hurry past her house, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights of the HOA meeting hall as they whisper nervously among themselves, their eyes flicking nervously toward the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that line the edge of her crumbling, forgotten empire.